introduce our speaker this evening. I was just talking very, very briefly to his brother, Mark, who came out of support from the family, Malcolm. I hope you've noticed that.
Now I got to pay him the $20.
Okay, Malcolm, a little bit about Malcolm. Malcolm grew up in Medicine Hat among one of the city's pioneer families, the Hargraves. And if you have had an opportunity to carefully look at the photograph on the front of your smoke signals, it was quite a clan at that particular time when that photo was taken. I got a magnifying glass out and I examined the faces of these people. And you know, it must have been an amazing, amazing group. So when you go home again, look at the front page of your smoke signals. It's a wonderful, wonderful photo, and I hope you address that maybe a little bit towards that this evening. Now, Malcolm's father, Jack, in particular, instilled in him an early interest in history. Isn't that interesting? History. Which, of course, Malcolm pursued at the University of Alberta, graduating with a BA. After some postgraduate study in France and a stint working at the University of Alberta, Malcolm returned to Medicine Hat in 1981 to join the family company IXL Industries, where he is currently the resident historian. I like that term. His interest in genealogy and history led him to much discussion with Hargrave family historians Hope Michael and Jackie Murray, well known to the Historical Society. Hope Michael, just an amazing early member of the Historical Society, involved in doing research. And Jackie Murray, who I met for the first time just a few years ago, when we had our anniversary of the Historical Society, we realized that young Jackie, who I think was in her teens at the time, actually did some work as secretary for the Historical Society way back when. One result of this research of Malcolm's was the publication of the memoirs of Will Hargrave as The Bear and the Bone King. Of course, it is one of the books that we have here selling through the Historical Society. And if you've never had a chance to look at that book, do make sure that you have a look at it. Better still, buy a copy. Malcolm was on the board and secretary of the Historical Society for a number of years and is a longtime member of the Friends of the Delta. He has researched various aspects of local history, including the pipe band and the brick industry. In fact, I think one of the first programs we had with you was about the pipe band, and that'd be about 7 years ago, if I recall. Close? Yeah. Pretty close. He is currently chairman of the Heritage Resources Committee for the City of Medicine Hat. Malcolm's son, Robert, and granddaughter, Naya, I wasn't too sure if this is Naya or Nia, Naya, live in Medicine Hat. Now, just consider this. Young Naya is the great, great, great granddaughter of James and Lexi Hargrave, part of their ongoing legacy in Medicine Hat. And to tell us all about the legacy, perhaps a little personal interpretation, but a lot of research, Malcolm Sisses.
Hopefully the technology is going to work here. Looking good. So I'm going to talk, hopefully in somewhat of a chronological order here, but I'm going to talk about how did the Hargrave family come to be in this area, first of all. And then secondly, what sort of involvement, how did the family develop in this area? And then I'm going to skip fast forward to the most recent event, which was the 125th anniversary of the ranch. So I'm going to skip over quite a bit of the middle period when the family had sort of gone through a couple of generations. So it's interesting to family, but maybe not so much to the general public. But the early days, I think, are particularly interesting. So we all come from somewhere. It's interesting, I looked at this map of England circa 800, and Hawick, or Howick, but they pronounce it Hawick, is where the Hargraves came from to Canada, and Lound is where Alexandra Sisson's family came from. So they came from two different parts of England. You can sort of see that one was a Danish part and one was an Anglian part, although by the time they left, those things had sort of been submerged. More particularly interesting was that the Hargraves didn't start out in Scotland. They actually started out in northern England. And the distant ancestor was apparently a Covenanter, which we're going back to about the 600s here, or 1600s here. And they were very strong on the Presbyterian style of religion, and at various moments they had the upper hand, and at various moments they had the lower hand. And in one particular period, when Charles II was back on the throne, they were being actively persecuted, and they had to do their religious ceremonies in the hills. And so our understanding is that the ancestral Hargrave had to move from England up into Scotland, where Presbyterianism was a little bit stronger, and that he was a Presbyterian preacher up in the hills, and they had to watch out for the King's Dragoons. The border country that the subsequent generations lived in was a very rough and tumble place. If you know a bit about the border country of England and Scotland, the story would be this weekend it's our turn. We get all our buddies and we get on our horses and we ride down into England and rustle a few sheep and kill a few people and herd the animals back up north, and then next weekend it's their turn. They come and rustle them and kill a few people and take them back again. That was the early days of ranching. You see some of the families there, the Armstrongs, the Elliots, the Carrs, the Scotts, and so on. So the Hargraves, though, were, we don't know a lot about their very early days, other than that strong streak of Presbyterianism, and also that in the historical period that we do know about them, they were shepherds. And they were in the Hawick area, moving around from farm to farm wherever they could find work. And in the post-Napoleonic era, there was quite a depression, an economic recession in Europe, and work was hard to come by. So they decided to emigrate to Canada, and first of all, one of a fellow called James Hargrave, not to be confused with the other James Hargrave, it gets very confusing. He came out in 1812, he was a Presbyterian minister. He was in Montreal until there was a smallpox epidemic. So then he moved south of Montreal to a place called Beech Ridge. And at that time, it was part of what they called the Scotch concessions. And it was all Highland and Lowland Scots. And interesting enough, in that area, they had to have a bilingual minister in the Presbyterian Church right up into 1900. And by bilingual, I mean, of course, English and Gaelic. So the family of Joseph Hargrave came out in 1819. Now, bear in mind that he was in his 60s at that time, so it was quite an adventure in a sailing ship to come over to the Canada of that era. This is the house they built. Still there, still occupied, although it's a French-speaking family now. Large families and successive generations lived in the house. There was quite a bit of tuberculosis, probably because it was a damp house. They were in close quarters. A number of them died. When you go to the graveyard and look, of course, at all the different deaths. It's sort of a rocky ridge. The farm is not that great. There's a few dairy cattle, a couple of fields, but definitely not what we would call out here a ranch. So, his father, John Hargrave, ran the farm, and then James was born on this farm. And grew up on this farm around animals and that sort of thing. But it wasn't looking like it was much of a living. And so James' uncle, also called James Hargrave, who is this is very confusing, the James Hargrave of the Hudson's Bay Company, the first James Hargrave of the Hudson's Bay Company, was the chief factor up at York Factory. And he was married to Letitia McTavish, of the McTavishes of that ilk. Her father was the chief of the clan, and they were quite influential in the Hudson's Bay Company. And so what we find is James gets a letter from William McTavish, who would be his aunt's relative, offering him work in the Hudson's Bay Company. And I'll read a little excerpt here that says, "The Hudson's Bay Company have agreed to offer you an engagement in their service for a term of 5 years at the following rates of salary, i.e. £20 sterling for the first year, £25 for the second year, and so on. And terms for which all young gentlemen enter the service as apprentice clerks engage." So then he goes on to give him the best route to get from a farm south of Montreal to Fort Garry, Winnipeg. Take Highway 138 to Montreal, go to Dorval Airport, jump on Air Canada 401, change planes in Toronto, and you'll be there by supper time. Not quite. He says the best route, I think, is by the Grand Trunk Railway from Montreal down to Detroit, and from thence to Chicago by the Michigan Central, from thence to La Crosse on the Mississippi by rail, and from La Crosse to St. Paul by steamboat. But then once he got there, what's not in the letter, but what Will Hargrave reports is that he got as far as Pembina by boat and canoe, and then a Cree Indian with a Red River cart met him, and he finished the last 100 miles of the Red River cart for several days, with no fires at night, despite the intense mosquitoes, because the Sioux were on the warpath. We're talking 1867. So James reported to work in Fort Garry, and he went to work. He was at Norway House and York Factory and several other sites, which I'll get to in a second. Meanwhile, this is Thomas Sisson's farm in Kent County, Ontario. The Sissons family had settled there in the 1830s, coming from Lound in England. I've been down there. The house is gone, but the corn patch is still there. And on an adjacent farm was a family of displaced Highland Scots, the Mackays, and of which Helen Mackay, or Hayley Mackay, which would have been her name in Gaelic, and they got married. And here's a picture of them in their latter years. And so they were farming there, and then one of their daughters married a Connor, and they went out west and settled at Portage la Prairie and said, "Hey, this is good land out here, it's free land, come on out." Partly because the government's forcing us to break up our farm. So they went out there in 1871. And they settled on this farm, which is right behind where the shopping center is there at the west end of Portage, and the farm is still there, and the farmhouse is still there, and the family's still there, many, many generations later. So this is Alexandra as a young girl. So she's a farm girl in Portage la Prairie, and of course she's going to go to the Hudson's Bay post there at Portage, probably that building in the back there. And she meets young James Hargrave. And James is out and about, checking on the different posts in the area, and he gets pneumonia. And he becomes quite sick, and he's living a little ways off, and Lexi decides that she needs to nurse him, which means spending the night watching him and making sure that he doesn't perish during the night. Well, it is not proper for a young lady to spend the night with a young gentleman, so they called in a minister and got married right then and there. Not expecting that James would actually survive, but he did survive with good ministrations from Lexi, though he lost one of his lungs as a result. So they traveled around in the fur trade. First posting was down at Fort Frances, and Jack and Tom Hargrave were born there, Tom being Bert's father. When they were traveling back from Fort Frances, they had to follow the Rainy River across Lake of the Woods, and at one point, the canoe they were traveling in overturned, and they had to swim ashore with their two little kids held above their heads to keep them from drowning. The original Indian name for Lake of the Woods is actually Lac des Orages, which means Lake of the Storms, and it gets some real rolling storms for sure. They came back to Portage where Queenie was born, so Queenie married Jim Mitchell later on. And then James reported to work for his last posting up at Cumberland House, and Lexi was to follow when the baby was a little bit older, like a few weeks or a few months older. So her job was to go across from Portage La Prairie to Cumberland House. You know where Cumberland House is, on the Saskatchewan River downstream from Saskatoon, almost right on the Manitoba border at the north end of Lake Manitoba. So hundreds of miles across the bush in a dog sled with 3 little bambinos and an Indian guide. And that's how she caught up to James at Cumberland House. So after this posting, James came back to Portage La Prairie, and he decided that life in the Hudson's Bay Company was winding up. The fur trade was kind of falling apart, wasn't nearly as vibrant in the 1880s. And he set up a farm, and his brother Andrew came out, and his sister Elizabeth had married Reverend William Mullins and was nearby, and Mary Jane, his sister, was not married and spent some time with them. And so Andrew took over the farm, and James and Dan decided, Dan being his brother-in-law, so his sister, or his wife Lexi's brother, decided they would go west and see what was going on west. And so they came as far as Maple Creek on the railroad, where it was end of rail at that point. And then they came to Medicine Hat and had a look around. It was just a surveyor tent town at that point. They rode on up to Calgary, looked around Fort Calgary, decided that would never amount to much. Came back to Medicine Hat. So good business decision. But and in practical terms, because of his time in Hudson's Bay Company, he could speak Cree. So Calgary is more of a Blackfoot area, whereas down here we were kind of right on the edge between Blackfoot, Cree, and Assiniboine. So it was a little bit more conducive to doing trade. So he set up a trading tent, actually right next to Peter Lougheed's grandfather, who was Senator James Lougheed, who was in the next tent. Dan had a son, Francis Ogletree Sissons, or Frank, who later came out. Dan was widowed, and Frank Sissons actually, first of all, he went with his father up to Fort Carleton, where his father was running the trading post. And later, during World War I, he was the colonel for the 3rd Canadian Mounted Rifles, raised a regiment here, took them off to France, just mindful of what Bruce is talking about World War I. And unfortunately, like many regiments, they were broken up when they got to England and used as replacements because there was such a high attrition rate. Anyway, Frank Sissons continued. When he came back after the war, he was involved in real estate and many other interests. But I'll just leave him for the time being. So Dan Sissons was James' partner. Here's a photo in 1887. So James bought 40 acres from the CPR in Riverside. The western edge of it was Division Avenue, running sort of from the river up along Division Avenue to the tracks, and I think a little bit above the tracks as well, because he used to pasture his cattle up on the side of the hill there. And right where Hargrave Park, Division Avenue is, he would cross the railroad tracks and the cattle would just roam around up on the hillside there. Just to situate you where you are here, the house there is about where Riverside Presbyterian Church is. And as you can see, there were no trees anywhere to be seen. The problem was that the grazing was fairly sparse on 40 acres, and so they moved out to the Little Plume Creek area and were almost immediately burned out of there by a prairie fire. So James had a friend, Little Corn, who was a Cree, and Little Corn said, "Come with me, I know where you can usually find good water out by the Many Island Lake area." So they headed out on snowshoe, is our understanding, and had a look around, and James decided that would be a good place for a ranch. In addition to his ranching activities, once they got out of the tent, they built this store, which is on the corner of Main Street and South Railway Avenue. Some people call it 2nd Street, but I'm starting a movement to call it Main Street from here on in. And a wooden store, and it was sort of his second trading establishment at the time. And he, in the early days, he would outfit the Cree with tea and sugar and gunpowder and whatever else they needed, and they would go out and collect buffalo bones, which were then stacked up and shipped off to Chicago. My understanding is for the phosphorus in them. And he had quite the clientele running. This is actually out of right in the museum. We have this page, but you can see his customer list here. We're primarily Cree with unusual names, although there's one guy just called Blackfoot. So I don't know. But he said that in all of his years of dealing with the natives and outfitting them on credit, he never lost a dime in any of the transactions. They always paid their bills, which was not something that you could say about the white settlers of Medicine Hat. And here's Little Corn. So we get to 1885, 86, and the Northwest Rebellion is occurring. There was worries that the local Cree would rise as well. The Blackfoot further west, Crowfoot, he was mulling it over, and unfortunately decided not to get into that mess. But the city fathers wanted the Hargreaves to move over to the south side of the river, where they were under the protection of the Halifax Regiment that was dug in up by on the hillside by Alexandra School. And Little Corn and his friends said, "Don't worry, we will know long before the police or the city people know if there's any trouble coming." So they stayed on the north side of the river, but Lexi didn't sharpen up her shooting skills. 1886, one of their children dies of erypolis. I've forgotten exactly what erypolis is. If there's many medical people here that could maybe help us with that one, but he was only 2 years old, and I'm not sure the exact circumstances of this. The only graveyard at the time was, I think, the Anglican cemetery, and I don't know whether it was James's strong Presbyterian upbringing, but about that time, I think between James and St. John's, they got Hillside Cemetery going, and this is the first grave in Hillside Cemetery. And it's still there. You can still find it up in the oldest part of the cemetery. So 1888, this is what the family looked like. You can see actually that they had an empty chair for Cecil. Tom, that's Bert's father. Will, who wrote the memoirs. Queenie, who married Jim Mitchell, my grandmother. And I think Harriet Mackenzie was a maid. I'm not sure exactly her circumstances. Jack Hargrave married Mary Jane Porter. And up here, Sergeant Drinkwater, who's got a firm hand on Nancy the Bear. And if you want to know more about Nancy the Bear, you have to buy the book. So this is about the earliest photo I can find of the ranch, but it's actually, actual fact is dated 1916. But not much to be seen in the way of trees. And in the very earliest days, Jack McDonald, who was a hired hand, and Tom Hargrave trailed the cattle from Little Plume out there. And there was what they call Hargrave Lake, which was basically just a very flat, shallow slough just to the west of the current farm site. And I'm going to get myself in real trouble here because I know Bob Porter's sitting back there and a very new bar, and if I make a mistake, they're going to jump up and correct me, right? About the same time, Presbyterians formed one of the first congregations in town, erected this wood frame church building, and it became actually the schoolhouse as well. And some of the Hargrave boys are right there. And J.K. Drinnan at the back was the schoolmaster, and he subsequently took over James Hargrave's trading in the store down on 2nd and South Railway. But James was on the first board that applied to the provincial government to form a school district here and set up the schools. So he was one of the first school trustees. And he was a very staunch Presbyterian elder, involved all his life, initially on the board of managers for the church, and got it going, helped to get the first building up, current building, 1901. And he remained an elder, a senior elder, right up until the day he died. So now we're moving along a bit. The children are getting older, and Queenie's the eldest girl, and in this photo, she's getting married to Jim Mitchell, who was a local rancher. And if you go out into the archives lobby, there's a photo wall there, and you'll see a picture of Jim Mitchell as a young man. He's a good-looking fella. I've never seen a picture of him. He always looks like an old geezer when I look at him in pictures that we've got, but that's the first time I've seen that picture of him as a young man. So the ranch, in my grandmother's album, it's always spelled with an E on the end for some reason, but Tom, although he went away to university, he came back, and Tom Hargrave eventually basically took over the ranch operation. And of course, subsequently then Bert and siblings and so on. So getting out to the ranch in the early days, here we go in a Democrat. It wouldn't be a 20 or 40-minute drive as it is today. Probably be the best part of a day's run to get out there. And so here they are on their way out. I think that's James, and I'm not sure who else is in the wagon there. Here's an early shot of branding at the ranch, and I did bring along a branding iron, which I got from James, and they retired this one from service, the JH brand. He said he thinks it's about 80 or 90 years old, so I mean, conceivably it could have been one of the ones used in that picture, but it might be a little bit newer than that. So they've got a collection of old branding irons, and he lent us this one for an artifact. Everything is big out at the ranch, including drinks of water, or probably coffee, it looks like. And I like this one. I think life must have been pretty hard out there at the ranch. They look like they're really working hard in this particular photo. That's Tom Hargrave sitting there, and a couple of his buddies or helpers, not sure who. So getting back and forth to the home on Riverside involved coming down by where the library is and crossing the river on the ferry. And so here's Tom with a horse, obviously headed across to the Hargrave homestead or home place on Riverside. And there's the actual ferry that they used to take across. Unfortunately, the photo's not the greatest, but you can see the Hargrave house back there, and it's now the second house on the site, the so-called stone house. So I would date this photo about 1908 or 9, thereabouts. Because Finlay Bridge was opened in 1908, it's got to be just kind of right at the tail end there. What's interesting to note, and I only kind of came to this conclusion or realization when we opened or put the designation on Finlay Bridge, is that from 1883 until 1908, the Hargraves crossed the river every day for work, for school, to go to the church, every day, And the only way of getting across was by ferry or the CPR bridge or on the ice. And of course, when the ice in the river was breaking up, there was no ice and there was no ferry. So you had to go around by the CPR bridge. And so that's, I figured it about 25 years crossing the river on foot, basically, in different ways. I have read some accounts where the kids crossed on the ice, and you know, it was kind of a little bit like Russian roulette in the springtime as to whether the ice was breaking up or not. So here is the basically the third Hargrave trading establishment. If you count the tent as the first one and the wooden store as the second one. Same place, same building. It's now a municipal historic resource, and some of the other buildings, most of the other buildings are now gone, but it's still standing. Of course, it was built of brick. Need I say more? This is a little bit later photo of the Altawana, which was the name they gave this stone house. It wasn't really stone, it was made of molded concrete blocks. And I gather you did a mail order for a mold, and you would mix up the concrete on site and put it in the molds, and then lay it up as masonry. And there's still a few retaining walls of this type around town, and Jack Knowles' house is built out of this material up on, was he on Cambridge, I think? And so there you have Heather's Cottonwood, which is getting to be a little bit more of a tree at this stage. So, you know, I'm not sure about exactly, maybe 1920s for this photo. So what a lot of people don't realize is that James Hargrave was also the president of the Redcliffe Press Brick Company, which is effectively IXL. And when you look at the early minutes, and we have the minutes, they were floating around in the mud water in the flood of 2010, and I rescued them and had them all out drying on my deck, each individual page, but we did rescue them. He and his various family members all had interests in the brick operation, but he was the president, which is a bit more like chairman of the board would be considered today. And so the plant was built in 1912, and it was not the first plant. In fact, it was the last plant in the area. And the story goes a bit like this. So Will Hargrave was down in Montreal taking his engineering course at McGill. And James and Lexi went down to visit him. And they were in an Ogilvy's store, which is like a Hudson's Bay department store today. And one of the clerks was Elsie Sissons. And she must have had a name tag or something on. And Hargraves commented on the fact that her name, Sissons, was the same as Alexandra's name. No known connection, but she said, "Why are you here?" They said, "I'm down visiting Will. He's 20 years old. He's a student here. Doesn't know anybody." She said, "Well, my brother Herb is about the same age. They should get together." And they did, and they became friends. So a little bit later, 1912, Herb, who was an electrician by training, was working for the Kerry company selling hotel kitchen equipment. And he came out west on a sales trip. He stopped to visit the Hargraves. 1912, Medicine Hat and Redcliffe were just booming, and they couldn't get enough brick, and they decided it'd be a great idea to get into the brick business. So he quit what he was doing, and they set up the Redcliffe Press Brick Company. And by 1913, they were making brick, and the first big job was hauled across the prairie by a horse and sled from Redcliffe to the St. Teresa's Academy. So here's a picture of the early manufacturing process. So typically a plant had only one of these brick presses and a brick operator, and then they would set them by hand in these kilns. A lot of hand labor. A lot of work done over the years. This photo is probably in the 50s or 60s, but it didn't change much from 1912 to the last time the kiln was fired in about 1981. So an interesting connection is that in 1916, Herb Sissons married Lissa Hargrave, daughter of Alexandra Sissons. So if you don't think that's confusing to sort out in genealogy, let me tell you. So they moved up to Redcliffe and had a house. which is Phil Monteith is here today, and he's living in their house. I'm sure there's parts of it that are still pretty much original to that time frame. And the Three Sissons boys, Gordon and his two twin brothers, Tom and Jack, grew up around the brick plant until 1929 when they acquired the Medicine Hat Brick and Tile and moved down to Medicine Hat. So that's Captain Pony that came from, I think came from either the Mitchell Ranch or the Hargrave Ranch. I'm not quite sure about that. So I kind of was thinking about this. So how does a guy who's a farm kid from Quebec, grows up on a small farm, gets the Medicine Hat, he becomes a Presbyterian elder, a merchant, president of a brick company, father of a big family, all the kids go to school, how does that happen? And so I think, he had a very supportive, resilient, in the background wife. By all reports, for those who knew her, said she had a very serious side, whereas he had a bit of a twinkle in his eye. But you think of what she went through to keep that family going in some of those places they lived. She was one tough lady. I think part of it was cultural. The Presbyterian work ethic was work hard, and he was quite religious. He read his Bible every evening in front of the fire. Being Scottish, anybody knows people of Scottish extraction, they're fairly canny and good set head for business. And he got his training in the Hudson's Bay Company, so he learned about accounting and keeping books and that sort of thing. He learned about making the trade, furs for flour, that sort of thing. He knew nothing about the brick industry whatsoever. And I can only think that his strategy there, as they hired Arthur Woodcock away from the brick and coal, was that you can't do it yourself, find somebody who can. And so it was Arthur Woodcock who actually set up the brick plant. As he come from Minnesota, he was in the brick industry. So a combination of factors, but he ended up being a fairly remarkable character in his day. A little bit later, photo of his family, about 1910. You can see the different children are starting to grow up, and there's some grandchildren showing up, lo and behold. That's my grandmother over there. I think this is Queenie here, and Lexi there, obviously. Not the whole family, but quite a few of them. The children did grow up, sort of. Looks like they're having a bit of a party here, and out on the prairie having a prairie picnic. So of the children, Jack Hargrave married Mary Jane Porter, and Bob and I have this discussion all the time. We try to figure out exactly who Mary Jane Porter was, and I think we got it figured out. So we're distantly related, probably married multiple generations later. Jack became a veterinarian, but most of his children moved away. Tom married Molly Winster, whose family was known to the Hargraves from Manitoba, and actually once they announced they were engaged and they were out in, her family moved out to Fernie, gives a little bit of an illustration of James Hargrave. He said he'd send out a care package of some fresh ducks. And so he was seen to put these ducks in a gunny sack, put them on the train, except for he substituted a bunch of old boots in the sack at one point and sent out a bag full of old boots for their, I think they were planning a big feast at the time. So Will Hargrave became an engineer, got involved in civil engineering, and actually was the source of those memoirs that formed the basis of The Bear and the Bone King. He also designed and built various projects around the Banff area and ended up living in Banff, including the Banff Park Gates. When you drive through the Banff Park Gates, those were his design and supervision. Queenie married Jim Mitchell. Queenie got her name. Her real name was Eleonora, which was quite a handle. Eleonora Jemima, named for various ancestral females. She got her name as Queenie because she was very small when she was in Cumberland House. And the natives there took to calling her the Little White Queen, somewhat in honor of Queen Victoria, I think, but somewhat because she was fairly imperious in her manner. And the last image I have of her, I was about 16 or so, leaving the medical arts clinic, and she would have been in her 90s, and she was sitting on the bench waiting for a cab or somebody to pick her up. And she was sitting there like this, with her cane out front, and just her head held high, and just looking like she was Queen Victoria. Mel and Walter Hawk. Mel was married to Walter Hawk. They didn't have children. They eventually, he was a vet. They ended up ranching, first of all in the Kootenays, and then ended retiring in Victoria. My parents took us out there one time. I was about 5 or 6 years old, and they had a little acreage and some chickens and a coop. And we three boys at that time, were sent out to play, and just don't open the chicken coop. Well, what are you going to do? This is my grandmother, who married Herb Sissons, and she was actually one of the first people involved in the Alpine Club of Canada back in sort of 1912, 1914 era. We have some great photos of mountaineering up in the Banff area. Heather, the tree next to the house, the youngest of the girls, was married to Tom Murray, who was from Minnesota. And Tom, in his bachelor party, it was decided that since his name was Tom Murray, Thomas Murray, that's it, no middle name, and they were sitting around, and he must have been sitting on a particular article of furniture because they decided his middle name should be Chesterfield. So he became Thomas Chesterfield Murray, and to the end of his days, he received his mail as T.C. Murray. Carl graduated. He joined the Royal Flying Corps during World War I, went overseas, came back. He married Amy Woodcock, who was the daughter of Arthur Woodcock, who was running the plant for Herb Sissons. And Carl ran the press for a year or two after he came back, and then he was offered a job over the hill at the Redcliffe Premier plant. And so he moved over there, and he started running the Redcliffe Premier plant, which was a direct competitor. And so you can just imagine what Sunday evening dinners around the family dinner table were like. But it is interesting because when you look through the later shareholdings of the Redcliffe Press Brick Company, he's the only one that doesn't have shares. So there was obviously, and when you talk to the Carl Hargrave's side of the family, Don Hargrave and so on, he said, yeah, there were some hard feelings at first. This is James and Alexandra, what I think is probably one of the best photos, 1925, their 50th wedding anniversary, and they got properly remarried, because their first marriage had been kind of a hasty affair, so they did it up and they had a big ceremony and got remarried. And within 10 years, both of them had passed away. And there's a later photo of the Hargrave home on Riverside. He left. Lexi died first, and then James died in 1935, and he left the home to the Presbyterian Church. It was used for many years as a deacon's college, and then one day, I guess the church decided they had a better use for the property, and it was just an old house in those days. It went under the wrecking ball, and the church was erected about where it is. In that first slide I had, Jim and Jackie Murray were in a second-hand shop in Calgary and discovered that mantle from that house, the house of their parents. And the Murrays had been looking after James after his wife died, so they were quite familiar with it. So now I'm going to fast forward a bit. The cousins grow up. There's a few cousins here. There's a couple of Murrays, my dad, my uncle. The cousins get married. So I'm talking generation 3 here. This is Zandy Murray, a daughter of Heather and Tom Murray, and Jack Valentine. And the Hargrave girls are stuck together pretty much. And interestingly enough, in the on the IXL side of the business, at a certain point, the boys in the family, so Jack and Tom, of course Carl didn't have shares, decided they had better uses for their share of the brick plant operation, and there was certain kind of family discussions, shall we say, about how things were being run. So at that point, the male side of the family, except for Herb, of course, sold their shares back to the company, and the female side of the family, so the Murrays and the Mitchells and the Hawks, stayed in business. And the Mitchells were actually in IXL right up into the 80s, so they kept their shareholding right back into then. So I've zipped through kind of the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, right up to pretty much the present here. What's left around town from James Hargrave in those early days? Certainly Hargrave Park, tucked away at the back of Riverside. He had gardens there. He sold off his land bit by piece to St. Pat's, to St. Joseph's for subdivision. Some of his family, actually Tom Murray and Tom Hargrave, had houses in the area. There's a view of the tree, so you can visualize where the house was, about where that red kind of covering the parking lot, more or less. The store is still there. It's been restored to a large extent, thank goodness, and it's, every time I go in there I kind of feel for his vibes, because he would have been in and around that store, and it's now a municipal heritage and municipal historic resource for the city of Medicine Hat, so that gives it a certain protection going forward. The Medicine Hat Brick and Tile, and he was president of the company when the Redcliffe Press Brick Company bought the Medicine Hat Brick and Tile Company back in 1929. And of course, after the floods and our decision not to reopen the plant, it has since become an Alberta Historic Site. So that's kind of basically, if you want to follow the direct lineal descendant from him getting started in the brick business way back in 1912. There's still some remnants of the Redcliffe Press Brick, the first brick plant in Redcliffe. We have a kind of a hope and a desire to preserve some of it. I'm not sure about those tall chimneys. Everybody gets a bit nervous around them, but we hope to preserve some elements of this in some sort of historic park in the future. So now, back to the beginnings. When they came to Medicine Hat, they were involved. They had a ranch on Riverside, they had cattle, and back to the beginning of the JH Ranch. So I asked James a couple of questions, and he said, as far as he knows, the original ranch was 3 or 4 sections, and I said, well, what do you have now under kind of the overall umbrella? And there's the Bull Springs Ranch, and the MacArthur Place, and the Old Systems Ranch, and the McKee Place, and he said about 78. So it's a pretty big holding now altogether. They're running about 1,100 cattle, 20 horses. It's interesting, when I was about 16, I asked Harry Hargrave how many horses they had at that point, and they were running about 60 horses. So you can see kind of the trend is going to more mechanized way of doing things. James tells me that, as far as he knows, the original cattle were probably Texas Longhorns. They kind of transitioned for a long time into Herefords, so white-faced Herefords. And then there was some fooling around with some of the more exotic European breeds, but really they made a decision to go with something called a beef booster. And afterwards, if you buy Bob or Barry a coffee, they might be able to explain what a beef booster breed is. But currently they have that running mainly with red and black Angus cattle. And he tells me that the red and black Angus cattle are a lot smaller than the Limousins and the Charolais and so on, but they don't need to be minded during the winter or in the early spring when they drop their calves. They tend to have smaller calves and things go better. They don't. James doesn't have the manpower to be around all the calves all the cows that are calving, so smaller calves are a benefit. He's also running them a lot more on grass now, trying to keep them on grass a lot longer. And he's got some pretty sound ideas, I think, on range management he's been trying to put into place. And, you know, when you talk to conservationists, you know, the way the ranchers have kept up the rangeland is, you know, better than any national park would do, I think. So anyway, this past summer, James and Liz and some of their cousins had the bright idea that they wanted to do a reunion, a 125th anniversary reunion of the founding of the J.H. Ranch. So it's not like it was the first one. Bert had held a reunion 20 years after the war, mainly for his army buddies, but lots of family and neighbors in the area were invited as well. And they had a big time and a good time, and I think it was quite a notable event in the history of the ranch. And then in 1988, on the 100th anniversary of the ranch, Bert's son Harry and children, Harry and Nairn and Colby and relatives decided to organize a 100th anniversary of the ranch. And my son Rob still remembers going out there that day, and he's just a little fella then, running around chasing the ball and getting dusty and that sort of thing. And so 2013 marked the 125th. I thought it was an amazing challenge for them to take on. Liz was about 8 months pregnant at the time that the event took place. So this is James and their son Hudson. So we're getting quite a few generations down the trail here. Hudson would be, again, great-grandchild of James and Lexi. So we arrived during the morning, most of us, and were met by a registration table. I'm just going to flip through these. These are just images of the reunion. And you were assigned a color-coded card depending on which branch of the family, going back to the initial children. Tents set up for food and all sorts of activities going on. You could visit the various buildings. This is the house that Bert and Amy built back in the 60s to replace the wood frame house they had. You could go for tours. Liz's father was running these tours out to look at a slide I'll show you in a second of the original dugout. And that's Harry and Anthea's log house that James and Liz are living in these days. So all sorts of games and activities for the children were organized. Meanwhile, I put up a wall of pictures and genealogical information to keep the adults amused and out of the sun. So the tour bus went out to the site of the original dugout that Jack McDonald and Tom Hargrave spent the first winter in a dugout on the side of the hill all winter long with the original cattle herd. This is just west of the ranch house. Now they hired a piper. I don't know where they got this guy. He didn't even have a kilt on, but I hired a piper to call the clan together for the speeches and opening ceremonies. And of course, we had, I don't know if they were haggis burgers, but Mike makes a mean haggis. If you ever want a haggis, Mike Steiner makes a great haggis. And chow for 300 people. So they had sent out emails and contacted various members of each branch of the family to try and get the word out. They set up a website, they sent out paper mail, and in the end they contacted, I think, virtually everybody in the clan. Of course, not everybody can make it. It was a weekend in the summer, but it was a pretty good turnout. And in addition to family members, some longtime neighbors were there, friends of the family. Although I think more of the James and Liz generation showed up more about 9 p.m. with cases of beer under their arms for the real party, while the rest of us went home to our beds. So there's activities, there's all sorts of things for the kids. the aforementioned Naya here. Lasso the calf. Now, that calf wasn't moving too fast. Tug of war, of course. Three-legged race, all the kinds of activities that you think about when you get a big family gathering and have to do something that gets everybody involved. This used to be the bunkhouse, which is now converted to a little museum. And it's on the site, and they have some branding irons and old saddles and various other implements that they've collected over the years. Egg race, sack race. I thought water was scarce out there, apparently not. Of course, you can't go to the ranch without looking at the horses.